Hello and welcome to WISH's webinar on the topic of California's Proposition 65. This presentation is designed to help our merchant community understand more about California Proposition 65 and how you can comply with all of the different regulations involved. So to start, we wanted to let you know that the information we're providing and or presenting in this webinar or slide deck material is not intended to and should not be construed as professional legal advice. Nor does anything contained here constitute an attorney-client relationship between Wish Legal and merchants. And merchants should seek independent counsel if they have legal queries. So I'd like to introduce our team today. We're very fortunate to have a number of really excellent speakers for you. We have Krish Thakar, who is Wish's senior legal counsel on the regulatory and compliance side. We have Dennis Ragland, who's a partner at Steptoe and Johnson LLP, who will be assisting us today. We have Erica Dominguez, who is a Wish product manager and who will be telling you a little bit more about all of the offerings on the Wish platform. And then my name is Betsy Mello, and I am a Wish sales enablement content specialist, helping to create this content for you today. So let's get started by talking about why Wish is presenting this webinar for you today. So we want to ensure that we're providing really quality-based benefits for you. That's why we've recently rolled out the Wish Standards program. And we're also dedicated to sharing really important information about marketplace regulations with you, our valued merchant community. We are definitely here to support and protect you to the best of our ability. Related to Proposition 65, Wish has been working diligently on your behalf to ensure that you can do business on our platform in the most effective way. So we want you to feel like you can be compliant with all of the different regulations that are out there in the areas where you're doing business. So in partnership with our consultants, we're providing you with this information really just to assist with your compliance efforts on your side. And we wanted to let you know you won't get this training anywhere else. We wanted to put something really special together for you. So what will we talk about here today? First off, Dennis is going to share a little bit about Proposition 65 at a high level. We'll talk about best practices so that you can try to avoid Proposition 65 violations. We'll run through how you can manage compliance with some of the features that Erica and her team have developed. And then we'll go into an FAQ at the end of the presentation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dennis to talk about Proposition 65.
Thank you, Betsy. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with Wish and all of you, and to help your merchants hopefully get something useful today out of this law and the description of it. Why don't we start with the basics? What is Proposition 65? It's a deceptively simple sounding law in California, and it means that you have to warn a California consumer prior to their purchase of a product if that product contains certain chemicals from a certain list that the state maintains. So let's talk about the Prop 65 list as it's known. There's about 900 or so chemicals that the state has determined could expose a consumer to either carcinogenic chemicals or reproductive toxicity chemicals. Those are the two categories: cancer and reproductive harm. So if one of those chemicals is on the list, a merchant or a manufacturer or a supplier has to be wary of that, because they could get a notice of violation by a private enforcer claiming that the violation of the law means you should have had a warning on that product before someone purchased it. And we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about what a warning is and what it should look like under this law to help you avoid getting any violation claims by a private enforcer. So chemicals, if you want to get more information on these chemicals, there is a place to do it. The state agency who runs the regulations and supervises, if you will, Prop 65 is called OEA, that's its shorthand name. And there's a website there that you can click and that has a bunch of information that could be useful to you in terms of if you have a deeper question about this law or the chemicals that are at issue. And you know, it's important to know, even though it's about 900 or so chemicals on the list, that sounds overwhelming. But really, the chemicals at issue usually are heavy metals like lead, of course, cadmium, mercury, and then phthalates. Phthalates can be found in vinyl, in plastic. It's a plasticizer. So that one can be very hidden, if you will, in terms of not knowing that that product has that chemical. By and far, lead is the most alleged violation chemical, and that's been the case since the law was passed about 30 years ago. This law was actually passed by the voters who voted for this in 1986. So in California, you can have a ballot initiative. And so that's how we got this law. And we have been dealing with it. And unfortunately, manufacturers and suppliers and retailers have been dealing with it for over 30 years. So you can go to this website to get more information about the law if you'd like. Let me tell you just briefly how these chemicals can be added to the list. As you can see here, there's a few ways. It's not just a chemical, it can be families of chemicals. And it can be elements and compounds, for example, and mixtures of chemical reaction, to name just three. So it really is a broad list of chemicals that the retailer, manufacturer, supplier, they need to be aware that they can have a number of chemicals in various forms like this to be wary of and to be prepared for. We'll talk a little bit about best practices in terms of how you can guard against these notices in a few slides. So what is covered? We know now what Proposition 65 is. We know about the Prop 65 list. Well, how do we apply that in real life to actual products? So unfortunately, it applies to almost all products sold in the state because the definition, as you can see on the right here, is very broad. A consumer product means any article or component part, including food, and food is covered, any component part or article that's produced, distributed, or sold for the personal use, consumption, or enjoyment of a consumer. Well, as you probably see from here, it covers almost everything. That is a very encompassing definition. And the courts here in California have said that's okay, it's covered. And by it, it means almost everything. Clothing, as you see here, auto parts, cookware, home goods, electronics. The list goes on and on. These is just a few of the samples, if you will, of what this law could cover and what you or others in the industry need to be aware of. And so again, it goes to the fact that this law is not only encompassing of all products, it's also very vague. And so how does one comply with the law when you don't know what the rules are, when you don't know what the products that could be covered are, when you don't know the listing of chemicals? So we'll talk a little bit about how you can guard against having to deal with those questions. So let's talk a little bit about Prop 65 and online marketplaces like Wish. The important thing to remember, we're going to look at the warnings in just a minute, but for online purchases, there needs to be a warning online, and it has to be in a couple of, you have a couple of choices. You can either put the warning on the page of the product, or you can put it in a page where when the zip code is entered in before the purchase is made, you would see a hyperlink with a warning. A warning can also be on the main page of the product. Now, not all marketplaces do it. Some of it is different from one to the other, but the bottom line is you have to have a warning before you complete the purchase by the California consumer. So that's important to understand. And also important to understand is how do you fit the warning on? What are the specifics of the warning? Because remember, Prop 65 is a warnings law. Just because you have a chemical in a product does not mean that it's hazardous or dangerous. It does not mean you can't sell it. All you have to do under this law, if you have a compliant warning, is put it on the product, put it on the internet page and or hyperlink. And that is coverage. That is compliance with the law. But you also need, under this law, not just an internet warning. You also have to put the warning on the product. So it's both to be a valid warning under the law. So the warning itself, as you can see here, I was just talking about the hyperlink. And so you got to have certain things in that hyperlink or certain things in the page that has the warning on it. And that's here you'll see the yellow triangle with the exclamation point and warning next to it. That's how your warning has to start. Otherwise, the warning will not be valid and compliant. And then on top of that, we need to understand that there's other language and requirements to the warning for it to be valid. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. But let's pause here for a minute. What's important information, especially for those companies who have never dealt with Proposition 65 or don't know what it is? And there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of companies that get hit with these violation claims and have never heard of this law and get caught up in it. And it can be very expensive to some. So as we've talked about, the warning requirement applies to Californians. It doesn't apply nationally. You only have to put warnings on sales to California. So that's at least one thing that is a benefit. Although obviously smaller companies don't have that luxury of being able to segregate California products from other products. But as I indicated a little while ago, Prop 65 is a right to know warnings law. Right to know means as long as the consumer has the warning about a product being in that, a chemical being in that product, that's enough. You are in compliance, you've done it, as long as your warning is correct. And we'll show you examples that you can use. Like I said, just because you have a warning on your product, Prop 65 warning doesn't mean that the consumer is in danger. It doesn't mean that the product is dangerous. It has to say only that the chemical is known to the state on that list. The state knows that that chemical is on the list, and it can expose you to carcinogens. It can expose you to reproductive harm. It didn't say it will. And remember, we don't know the level of chemical in a lot of these, if not any product. That requires testing at a lab. So you could have a very small amount of, for example, lead in your product. The other side sends a violation notice to you, and you are on the defense. You have to prove that the product is in compliance. And that can be very expensive. And so again, the best offense is a good defense, because the burden is on you once you get a notice. So, and I talked about some of this. Like I said, you're presumed guilty, and that can be very difficult to fight, depending on the case, depending on how much you've sold into California. The more units a company sells into California, the more expensive a settlement can get. So it's important to think about strategy when people get these notices in terms of, should we look at a settlement? Should we fight this? What are our options? So you really need to talk about that in terms of what the best steps for you and your product and your company are. We had a previous governor that called Proposition 65 shakedown lawsuit, encouraging shakedown lawsuits. And what that means is this law allows plaintiffs' lawyers to get part of any settlement and part of any verdict if it goes to trial. So as you can imagine, there is a lot of activity by a lot of lawyers trying to get a lot of money off of this law from the unwary and those who are never, or those who think their product is in compliance and it isn't. So again, a good offense is a good defense here. Settling cases under this law can be quite expensive. We have some in the mid six figures for bigger companies. We have some in the 5 figures for smaller companies. It really runs the gamut. But regardless, a defendant has to hire its own lawyers sometimes. And then if it's going to settle, it has to pay penalties on top of legal fees. We'll talk about penalties in a minute. Well, we'll talk about them right now. $2,500 per day per violation. That's what a violation, excuse me, that's what a penalty can be under this law. We've never seen anything like that in terms of amounts of penalties. It's a very vague, just like the other provisions we've talked about. It's a very vague vague law. Over the last several years, though, penalties have ranged, as you can see here, from $20,000 to over $700,000. Obviously, that's a bigger company with very big sales. But the point being, this is very amorphous. And so not only for companies who don't understand the law, they can be in violation and subject to penalties and not know how much those are going to be. And so companies sometimes need to pay a lawyer to defend them. Then they have to pay to settle the case and pay plaintiff's lawyer. And then they have to pay penalties. So it's as I said at the outset, it can be a very complicating, confusing law, but it is a penalties law. So keep in mind that you pay on different subjects, if you will, attorney's fees, settlement costs to the plaintiff's attorney, and then penalties. So we've got the background of Prop 65 now. We understand the risks. We understand the costs that can come with it. How does the process work? You've heard me talk about a word called violation, the term notice of violation. That's how Proposition 65 matters begin. You have to have some knowledge as a plaintiff that the product at issue has the chemical at issue for which you claim the defendant is in violation. So as you can see here, there's like a 4-step process. Number one is to start the process, the plaintiff has to have some basis to know that the chemical at issue is in your product. And that's usually done by testing. What the plaintiff will do is go to the store, buy the product, and then test it at an outside lab. And if that product has lead in it, the plaintiff can serve this notice of violation to you. And then there has to be a 60-day wait period before they can file a lawsuit in a court. And that's helpful to some extent because during those 60 days, a company can investigate and it can make some determinations on how it wants to proceed. And then if the idea is to settle early to save some money, that's the time you do it so that you don't then incur costs for court if a lawsuit is filed. So the 60-day notice comes next. Then you have the 60 days where you can investigate and negotiate with the other side. I've done plenty of that with clients, and it can be very effective in terms of saving money if you do it early, but that doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes it can be an issue where you need to defend the product and fight it. So you do have both options, but during that 60 days, that is the best time to resolve a case if the decision is to settle. Finally, as I indicated earlier, I've said this probably a couple times, but it's worth repeating. The burden shifts automatically. The burden to prove that your product is in compliance shifts automatically when the plaintiff serves this notice. And that's, in my opinion, unfair. In my opinion, it is too easy for a plaintiff to start a claim of violation. But that's what we're stuck with. I should say that the California legislature has tried to revise this law to make it more fair to defendants, and they have failed. So we are stuck with this type of 4-step process. So with all of that, what are the best practices to avoid these violations, right? Well, the first one, if I can get there, I'm going to let Chris talk about these next 2 parts, but one of the things to understand here is, like I said, the law's here to stay, and there's been a recent court case here in California. It was against Amazon, and it was involving products on their marketplace. And a higher court in California just last week made a ruling that Amazon and any marketplace, well, it said Amazon, but this could apply to any marketplace, is considered a retail store, if you will. It's a retailer. And so that means that liability can attach to the marketplace, and liability therefore flows to the merchant using the marketplace. And so it's very important to comply, because you can face some consequences to that. And so I'll let Krish talk about those.
Thank you very much, Dennis. And echoing Dennis's sentiments, it's a pleasure to be here. I am, as Betsy mentioned earlier on, senior counsel, and I work at Wish Legal. So as Dennis was mentioning, there's several consequences to both the platform and to merchants for violations of California Proposition 65 regulations. In addition to the legal ramifications that Dennis explained earlier, Wish has crafted and has policies that can also lead to merchants facing policy violations and consequences as a result. And these are crafted to and designed to protect both Wish, but also the merchant base and the marketplace community as a whole. The first consequence that merchants could face is a account freeze and a suspension. And this is really to protect the merchant and Wish for any future litigation as it arises from notices of violations that plaintiffs and plaintiffs' attorneys can bring. We also have the ability under our policy to enforce geographic blocks now into California, and even some remedies for egregious violations, such as permanent removal from our platform as a result of violating the terms of service and policies that merchants are expected to adhere to and follow. On the other side, in the event that there has been a lawsuit and there is a settlement, then again, to both protect Wish's interests as well as merchants' interests, Wish does have the rights to claim indemnification from merchants under our terms and conditions, policies, and terms of service. And often at times, there can be a settlement which has provisions, and it's very common, which ultimately benefit merchants as well. And upon a cost-benefit analysis, we have found in experience that the amount that a merchant would ultimately owe in indemnity to Wish for these types of violations is relatively lower than what they would have been paying had the settlement agreement not existed. With that said, I'm going to hand it over back to Dennis for further best practices on compliance with California Proposition 65. Thank you.
Thank you, Krish. So let's talk, in addition to what Krish is talking about to protect yourself with your accounts at Wish, how do you do that? How is the best way to comply with this law? Well, as I indicated earlier, testing the product is something the plaintiffs do before they can file their case. So the question folks have to ask themselves, companies like retailers and suppliers, the question that has to ask there is, what's in our product? Because to make a warning, you have to know at least one chemical that you're warning about, and you have to put that chemical on the warning for it to be a valid warning. So there are hundreds of testing labs now all over the world that can run fairly simple and fairly affordable tests on product for at least the main chemicals. As I indicated to you, that usually is heavy metals like lead, cadmium, mercury, for example. And then the plasticizer phthalates. You see that a lot in vinyl, like purses and handbags and shoes, among other things. But having some basic testing on the product puts you in a driver's seat, in the sense that, let's say you test your product and it's got lead in it, you can make the determination to put a warning on the product packaging. And then if it's sold online, like I was saying earlier, you put the warning online. You say that the product contains lead, and we'll look in just a minute about the specific language, but you put that in there. And like I said earlier, that's a complete defense to the law. So you can protect yourself from future claims of violation. Now, it doesn't protect you once the notice of violation has started. So for that product or that class of products, you will need to contend with the law and decide whether to settle or fight. But on the other side, if you've got products that haven't been receiving a notice of violation, you can consider putting warnings on. So that's number one. Number two, as I indicated, you got to do two labels, both on the product and online, to be compliant. And again, it's important to know that just because the warning is on the product doesn't mean your product is hazardous, doesn't mean your product will hurt people. It just means you're warning them that a chemical is in the product that the state says may cause cancer or reproductive harm. So again, online warnings have to be a certain way. They have to be visible to the purchaser before the sale of the product is completed. And that's done in different ways. And it depends on the platform. It depends on the way they do it. There can be, like I said earlier, a hyperlink. You click that, and then that would take the consumer to a warning. Or you can do a full warning on the product page. It's got to be prominent and conspicuous. That's the most important thing, as well as we said, warnings on packages and online. If you do those, and if the language is correct on your warning, you have a complete defense, and you should be fine. So if we have to have a warning, what does it need to have in it? There are a couple things. The wording requires the warning label be based, or the warning on the online page. Either warning has to have the type of chemical or chemicals that you are warning about in the product. You have to have what type of harm the chemical or chemicals may cause. For example, lead, that may cause reproductive harm. So your warning has to include lead, and that the state says it could cause reproductive harm. And we'll look at the exact language in the next slide or two. And there's also, this is state-approved language that should be indicated, because some plaintiffs in other places, some defendants in other instances will put different language on, thinking, well, I put a warning on, that should be enough. That's possibly true. The language has to be a certain way, clear. As you can see, it's got to be clear and conspicuous, if you will. And the easiest route, though, to avoid confusion with that, because that type of warning where you do your own is often not compliant. So the better way to do it, and the way WISH requires you do it, is you use what's called safe harbor warning language. And that's the warning that the state of California has approved as a warning to prevent a notice of violation. So here's the warning language. And there's two types of warnings, we should say. There's what we call short form, and then there's the long form. And the short form can say just the two chemicals, or one chemical rather. This one, I'm sorry, doesn't have to say any chemicals. It just has to say the type of harm that the chemical can cause. This one, for example, has both cancer and reproductive harm, which you can do. You can put both on a warning. And then it has to give the website to the state agency where a consumer can go for more information. The long form warning has this language. You have to say the product can expose, and it's got to say chemicals, and you have to put your chemical here. So as I indicated earlier, lead, for example, or you could put two, one for cancer causing and one for reproductive harm. And then again, you put the website there. A lot of companies, if you do a chemical like lead, it's also a potential carcinogen. And so they'll say can cause cancer and reproductive harm. So again, if you're going to warn for more than one chemical, and the max is two, as long as you warn for two chemicals, you can put both types of risk on, unless that risk is the same, like lead. So there's some real important things that need to be on this warning for it to be valid. I mentioned earlier, there has to be a triangle that's yellow with an exclamation point. Warning has to be in all caps, and then it has to be in bold print. You can then put the warning either starting right next to that, the warning language, or you can put the warning language underneath it. The warning language has to be similar to the other text that you've got on the product or the product page. It can't be difficult to find. It can't be too small to read. And so 6-point type is the smallest. And then I should go back and point out that this short form warning can go is good for smaller products and smaller packages that people will something like a fishing lure will come in a small package versus something like big box of dog food or something. The one thing to consider here is which warning is more scary, if you will. This one says cancer and reproductive harm. This one says the product can expose you. Doesn't say that it will. So there is some debate as to whether the short form warning is suggesting you will get chemicals and you will have risk from these. So again, it's a business decision, and some people have only a small package, and so the short form is the best option for them. All right, so we've got our warning language, we've got how the warning has to be done, and then we'll stop here and have the WISH folks talk about how you comply as merchants with options.
Thank you, Dennis. This is Chris here again. So as Dennis mentioned, there's different options that WISH offers to its merchant base to comply and to assist with future compliance with Proposition 65. The first of the two options that we offer is it supports merchants with the ability to continue selling into California, given that it's the merchant's responsibility, as Dennis mentioned, to proactively display the required warning notice on their products or their packaging. It's also a responsibility for merchants to display it online in their product listing. And Swish is supporting merchant compliance with these requirements, as Erica is going to mention on the next few slides. We've enhanced our merchant dashboard with features to help your business comply with these requirements and generate online warning labels for applicable product listings. The second option of the two that Wish is currently offering its merchant base is the ability to completely opt out of selling their goods into California. We understand that not every merchant, just like every other business, offline or online, may not have the ability to comply with California Prop 65 requirements. And so if you choose not to sell into California, we have made it easy for you to opt out so that your products cannot be sold into California through Wish. With that said, I will move on to the next slide, which talks about the tooling. And before I hand it over to Erica, just wanted to mention that we have really the three real features that we offer merchants that we've developed to support you comply with Proposition 65 requirements. Erica is going to go into our product listing tools that helps automatically generate warnings on your online Wish product listings, which can appear on the actual PID page or during checkout on Wish if the item is being shipped into California from outside California. The second is standardized labeling language. Wish is offering pre-written language that you can use as a resource for online listings, but also that you could potentially use for your physical product and or packaging labeling as well. On this point, just want to point out that if there's any questions, we do encourage you to seek independent professional or legal advice to make sure that the labels that you're putting on your products physically are compliant. And the third, as mentioned on one of the previous slides by myself, is the opt-out option. As of this time, Wish will be offering the ability for you, if you want to opt out completely of selling into California via either the merchant dashboard or API, which Erica is going to go into a bit more detail in the following slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Krish. All right, so when you create or update a product listing in the merchant dashboard or through the API or via CSV file, you'll have the option to provide which Prop 65 warning type and chemicals are applicable to your product. So Wish will then automatically generate and display the corresponding compliant warning labels that will be placed on your online listings. And these warnings will only be visible to Wish customers with an IP address that's located in California, in addition to customers with California shipping addresses. All right, so as mentioned, you have the option to provide, say, Proposition 65 warning type and chemical names through our V3 API. You can use the create and update product endpoints to provide the warning type and chemical names via the new parameters that are listed here. If you're connecting to Wish through an ERP, your provider will have the ability to send CA Prop 65 information to Wish for your product listings. We recommend that you check with your ERP for information on how to access and provide CA Prop 65 attributes on your behalf. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here you'll see how the CA Prop 65 warnings will appear to customers on Wish. The customer will be able to click on the More Info link in order to see the full warning. Next slide. Customers with California shipping addresses will also be able to view the warning during the checkout process. So merchants who do not wish to provide CA Prop 65 information for a listing can instead choose to disable shipping to California for their listing. Via the API, they can do this by using the update product endpoint. Next slide, please. Merchants can, there we go. Merchants can also disable California via the product CSV page in the merchant dashboard. So from the product CSV page, select Edit Shipping in the Action Type dropdown. Then create a CSV file with 3 column headers, parent SKU, US_CA, and warehouse name. In order to disable product for California, add disabled as a value in the US_CA column. Lastly, upload the CSV. Merchants can also disable California via the Edit Shipping page. On the merchant dashboard products page, you can search for a product, then click on the link under the country shipping price column. You'll be taken to the Edit International Shipping Options page. Here, you'll search for or locate the United States, then locate California and toggle the California switch to off, then click Save Changes. Now I will pass it back to Krish to go over a few frequently asked questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. So on this slide, we have some frequently asked questions that we felt would arise. And obviously, there might be more, and we would have an email address which you can reach out to if any further questions around policy and Wish's stance on its Prop 65 policy arise. But the first question here is, should I pay special attention to how some products are labeled more than others? It's best practice that merchants always ensure all their products are properly labeled, whether it's online or physically on the packaging or the product itself. We've listed a few top of mind litigated products here that have been subject to violation notices. but this is not an exclusive list. And as Dennis mentioned earlier on, it's a very extensive list and an even more extensive product category list. So it could be any consumer product that is being sold into California, applicable to Prop 65. You may ask who you need to talk to ensure your products are in compliance with this legislation. Our suggestion here is that in addition to working with independent professionals and consultants or counsel, you should also work with an accredited test lab to make sure that your products are compliant with Proposition 65 listed chemicals. And we've provided a link to an exemplary list of test labs that are accredited and approved at the link in this slide, which will be shared with you after the presentation, and which is also available on our merchant FAQ for Proposition 65. Third question is, which chemicals are the most common to lead to Prop 65? And similar answer as before regarding products, but we can mention to you that the most common ones that we've seen at Wish and that we've seen with Dennis, our outside consultant on this point, involve heavy metals such as lead, cadmium, arsenic, and mercury, and phthalates, which come up very frequently. Another question you may ask is, do I need to put more information about Proposition 65 on my photos, title, description, on my product listing at Wish? And the answer is not necessarily, because when you're using our new features, they'll automatically add that information that you need into the listing or photographs. You're welcome to add more information if you so wish, to the extent that it's accurate. But in terms of Proposition 65 required language to comply with Wish's policy, the feature should help you comply with the requirements. And finally, on this point, I just want to mention that when you're in doubt, please feel free to reach out. As mentioned, you should always seek independent advice for queries relating to products that contain significant trace amounts of Proposition 65 listed chemicals. And I'm going to hand it over to Dennis here to go through a list of options where you would be encouraged to reach out to outside counsel. Dennis, do you want to take it over from here?
Sure. Thank you, Krish. So yes, there are instances where you might be in a need for legal counsel. Not always, but some companies do choose to consult so that they can determine what's the best way to respond to these violation notices. So like I said earlier, it's important to test a product so that at least you know what you're dealing with. That's what gets a lot of folks into trouble in these notices, is they get supplied a product or they make a product and they don't have a clear idea of what's in it. So testing is at the top of the list here, and it's top of the list for a reason. There's also the opportunity, and we haven't talked about that much, of reformulating. In other words, if you've got a certain product with a certain chemical, you have the option, if it's feasible for you and your suppliers, to substitute that chemical with something else. And that would take care of the problem to the extent that that reformulation is not going to get you in trouble. And then, like one of the things to understand, and I say this to clients all the time, is what do you want to do in terms of your end game, right? If you're going to settle a case, it's got to be for your business needs. It's got to be to your business's benefit. It's got to fit your budget. Trying to fight these cases on your own can run into the 5 figures if you try to settle early. It can go into the high 5 figures if you have to go further in the litigation. So again, test your product, understand that the costs of this law can become very high, and that may affect your strategy. And then you got to be ready to deal with your customers. Sometimes companies will get inquiries from customers saying, what is this warning? Is this product dangerous? And again, it's a California only law, but not many companies can segregate their California product with other state products. So if that's the case, then you have to consider being able to talk with the customer and tell them, or have your lawyer tell them if you have a lawyer, or maybe have a page that explains it on your website. We see that a lot. And you explain what Proposition 65 is and how it affects or applies to your business. And those pages can say, this is a California law. A warning doesn't mean the product is hazardous. We're complying with this law by putting a warning on. Our product is in compliance with all laws. In other words, you can put some context for your customers as to why they're seeing this warning, and hopefully put them at ease when they have concerns.
Okay, thank you so much to all of our presenters, and thank you to our merchant community for taking the time today to spend this period with us, learning more about Proposition 65 and how Wish is supporting you. As Krish mentioned, we have a few links that were shared in this presentation. You're probably viewing this webinar either on our YouTube channel or on our blog, and we're going to be sharing those links with you in the notes or the comments of both of those two channels. But if you need to reach out to our team to learn more about the product or anything else, feel free to shoot us an email at merchant_support@wish.com. And we will do our best to get back to you in a timely manner. So thank you again, everyone, and have a great day. Take care.